All right, let's talk about a real workhorse in the world of software design, the template method pattern. We're going to dive into how this simple blueprint can seriously clean up your code and, honestly, just make your life as a developer way easier. Okay, let me ask you something. Ever get that weird feeling of déjà vu when you're coding? You're typing out a block of logic and you think, wait a minute, this looks exactly like something I wrote last week. It's not just annoying, it's a recipe for a maintenance nightmare down the road. So, let's paint a picture to make this super clear. Imagine you're building this awesome data mining app. Its whole job is to crack open different kinds of documents, PDFs, Word docs, CSV files, and pull out all the juicy, useful information. And this is where the mess starts. See, opening and actually reading a PDF is totally different from parsing a CSV file. That part has to be unique. But what happens after you get the data? The analysis, the number crunching, generating the final report, that stuff is almost always identical. And this leads to so much duplicated code. The big question is, how do we fix this without losing our minds? And that, my friends, is where the template method pattern swoops in to save the day. The best way to think about it is as a master blueprint for an algorithm. So here's the big idea, right? You create a base class that defines the rigid, unchanging skeleton of your process. But, and this is the clever part, you leave certain steps open, like empty slots, for other classes, the subclasses, to fill in with their own specific details. Yeah, this is the line you got to remember. It's all about getting consistency in the overall process while keeping flexibility right where you need it in those individual variable steps. It's kind of like the Hollywood principle. The main class says, don't call us, we'll call you when it's your turn to perform your special step.
When you get down to it, this pattern has two main players. First, you've got the abstract class. Think of this as the project manager. It holds the master blueprint, the template method, and it knows exactly what steps need to be done and in what order. Then you have the concrete classes. These are like your specialized workers. They inherit that blueprint and get to work implementing the nitty-gritty details of each specific step.
Okay, that might still sound a little abstract. So let's bring it down to earth with a super simple analogy pretty much everyone can understand. Making a hot drink. Because really, whether you're making tea or coffee, the basic steps are surprisingly similar.
So, the recipe, or our algorithm, looks something like this. You always have to boil water, and you always pour it into a cup. Those steps are fixed, they never change. But how you brew it and what you add to it later, well, that's what makes it either tea or coffee. Those are our variable steps. See how this works? A tea maker class would fill in the brew step by steeping a tea bag, and the add condiments step by, say, adding a slice of lemon. But a coffee maker class uses the same blueprint and implements brew by dripping hot water through coffee grounds, and add condiments by adding sugar and milk. The skeleton is exactly the same, but the details are completely different.
Okay, that's enough coffee and tea. Let's get back to the code and see how this looks in a more technical, real-world example.
Data sync is one of those tasks that comes up all the time. You need to move data from one place to another, and while the source and destination can change, the overall process usually stays the same. It is a perfect candidate for this pattern.
So what we can do is create an abstract data synchronizer class. Its main job is to hold our template method. Let's call it synchronize. This method basically lays down the law. It dictates the entire sequence. First, you open the source and destination, then you transfer the data, and finally you close both connections. That sequence is set in stone.
And now for the magic. We can create all sorts of different concrete classes. For example, a database to file synchronizer would know how to connect to a database and write to a flat file. An API to database synchronizer follows the exact same template, but it knows how to connect to a web API and write to a database instead. The key thing here is that the core synchronize logic, it's written only one time. That is a huge win.
All right, so this pattern sounds pretty great, right? But like any tool in your toolbox, it's not perfect for every single job. We got to talk about the pros and the cons.
So let's break it down. On the one hand, the big pro is that it's just fantastic for getting rid of that nasty duplicate code. It gives you this pinpoint control over which parts of an algorithm your other developers are allowed to change. But on the flip side, that structure can be really rigid. You can't just change the order of the steps on a whim. And if you have a ton of different variations, you could end up with a boatload of subclasses, which can get complicated.
So with all that in mind, what's the big takeaway? When is this actually the right tool for the job?
You really want to reach for this pattern when you start seeing that déjà vu moment, when you spot several classes that have almost identical algorithms, just with a few small differences. It's also perfect when you want to let people extend your module, but only in very specific, safe places. It's a great example of the open/close principle. Your main class is closed for modification, but it's open for extension.
So, if you boil it all down, what this pattern really gives you is that perfect balance between structure and flexibility. It standardizes the high-level flow of an operation, but it gives subclasses the freedom to handle the unique details their own way.
And that's pretty much the whole story. So the next time you find yourself about to hit copy-paste on a big chunk of logic, just pause for a second and ask yourself, where could a simple blueprint simplify my own code? Thanks for joining me.